So if you've played through a couple runs of Hades 2, then you've probably at some point sat down and asked yourself the question that you see on the screen in front of you, which is how do you actually do damage in the game? And to an extent, this is a question of meta progression. Mel needs to collect the appropriate meta currency, then she needs to stick them in the appropriate place so she can get the right buffs so that she can get big and strong and she can beat up on Kronos. But this is only half of the equation. The other half of the equation is actually understanding damage systems so that you can make good choices with gods and good choices with your boons. Unfortunately, understanding damage means math, and math means a PowerPoint. Now, I recognize that this video is going to be pretty dry, and most people probably, myself included, to be honest, don't want to watch someone just talk over a PowerPoint for like the 20 minutes this is probably going to end up being. So I am going to include a set of summary slides at the end that if you want to, you can just skip to those and give yourself a nice cheat sheet. Anyways, let's get into it. So let's take the simplest case, right? Which is that we're attacking with a weapon and we have a percentage damage bonus. So this is something like maybe Aphrodite's attack or Apollo's attack, something along those lines, right? How does this work? Well, one thing you can do is you can just look at the formula, which is at the top of the screen here, but maybe it's easier to think of this in terms of a practical example. So let's imagine that we're attacking with our daggers, so those have a 20 base damage strike, and we get a 100% damage bonus from Apollo. Well, the game applies the formula, it takes your 20, it multiplies it essentially by 2, because you have a 100% damage bonus, and it arrives at 40. And this is a 100% increase in your damage, this is exactly what you would expect. And so there's nothing interesting to see here, right? But let's imagine now that we're going to add an additional bonus, right? So if we look into our Arcana page, right, we have the Huntress, right? And the Huntress gives us a 50% multiplicative bonus on our attacks and specials as long as we're not at full magic. What happens if we add this in? Well, the game goes through the formula again, right? Takes our base 20, it adds up our percentage damage bonuses, multiplies them together, and gets 50. And that's a little bit strange, isn't it, right? 50 is only a 25% increase from 40. So what is happening here? Well, the answer is that percentage damage bonuses don't inherently synergize with each other. If you've played a lot of video games before, then you've probably heard this term before. These bonuses are additive. They don't multiply into each other. And what this means practically is that your percentage damage effects have somewhat diminishing returns, right? The more of them you get, the less each one starts contributing to your total damage output, the less noticeable that they are, right? And so what this means is that if you have a large percentage damage bonus, then you should focus on just finding other large percentage damage bonuses. So something like Origination is 50%, Weed Killer can be 100-something%, and at that point you just drop it, right? You don't need to worry about it beyond that point. You don't need to worry about the small stuff, right? You don't need to grab the 20% from Sweet Surrender or Perfect Image or Uncommon Grace or anything like that, right? Just grab a core couple and get out. Now, the other way you could do damage is you can do damage with a flat damage bonus, right? So maybe the archetypal example here is Poseidon's Waves, right? So let's take the same example, right? We have a 20 damage strike from our dagger. We have a 20 damage wave from Poseidon. The game just adds those two up and you will get 40 damage, right? It will do it across 2 instances, but you will get 40 damage. And that's still a 100% increase. But what if we change the base amount, right? So what if we say 100 base damage, right? In this case, we will still get the 100 base damage when we attack, we'll still get the 20 damage wave, but now we deal 120 damage, and this is only a 20% increase. And so what does this mean? It means flat damage bonuses are relatively more effective on weapons which have low base damage, and you'll sometimes hear me call these rapid attacking weapons, because of course the game has its own sense of balancing, so weapons which have low base damage often attack faster, right, to make up for it. Is this the only difference between flat and percentage damage boons? And it's not. So let's first start by adding in the Huntress, right? Well, if we add in the Huntress, right, we still get our 20 damage strike, right, returning to the 20 damage dagger strike, we still get the 20 damage strike, it gets buffed by a 50% Huntress bonus, we get the 20 damage wave, and we still end up at 50. And we still only get a 25% increase in damage. So far, flat damage bonuses and percentage damage bonuses seem to be operating roughly the same. The place where this changes is when we start adding in global damage. So we have the example from before, we have the 20 damage strike, we have the 100% bonus from Apollo, But hidden in the global damage in our Arcana page is an 80% global damage bonus, 50% from origination, 30% from the Furies. Now, if we start stacking that in, we end up with 56 damage, which is only 40%, right? Half of 80. In the same way that previously our 50% bonus turned into an actual 25% increase. This changes when we do it with flat damage, right? So, as before, let's imagine a 20 base damage strike with a 20 damage wave from Poseidon. We do 20 plus 20, 40 damage for our 100% increase. What happens when we add the global damage in? Well, what happens is that we add 80% to our base attack. This is the same as before. But then we also add 80% to the Poseidon waves. Why? Because the Poseidon waves are a separate instance of damage. They are a separate source of damage, and so our global damage bonuses also apply to them. What does this mean? Well, when you do all the math out, you get 72 points of damage. Previously, we were doing 56. Now we're doing 72. That's a 16-point increase, right? That's a lot, right? 16 points. That's basically an extra Poseidon boon. And we shouldn't be surprised about that, because 80% is near 100, and that's, of course, where all of our extra damage is coming from. And so what does this mean? Well, it means that global damage bonuses synergize very, very well with additional sources of damage, right? So one way that you can think about scaling up your damage is, well, if I have a percentage damage bonus and I keep stacking specific percentage damage bonuses, that's not a very efficient way to do it, right? I have diminishing returns. But if you start taking global damage bonuses and start taking additional damage sources, these two will multiply into each other, and they do synergize to give you that extra bit of damage. And while it might not feel like a lot when we put it in the math, right? Realistically, what does this mean? It means you're doing, for example, in our previous example, you're dealing something like 25% more damage. That's a lot, right? You're going to feel that when you start hitting the bosses with 25% more damage. And so in particular, right, if we look at it from a more mathematical perspective, because of the Furies and the origination, providing us with an 80% boost, additional damage sources are a lot more valuable than they appear. About twice as valuable as they appear. And this leads to an interesting corollary, which is that palms, and rarity for what extent that matters, right, on additional damage sources also are about twice as valuable as they appear. Now, this does have some implications on what we should be palming, right? In particular, maybe you want to refrain from palming your percentage damage effects as much, and you want to palm your additional damage sources more, right? But you should also remember that the damage scaling on individual boons is different, and in particular, the damage scaling, for the palm scaling changes depending on the number of palms you have. So remember to go into the game and do the math yourself, right? Just keep in mind that if two things look identical, right, but one is an additional damage source, you should be palming that. Now, we might ask ourselves the questions of, well, okay, our rapid attacking weapons, they want to use flat damage increases. These flat damage increases, they work really, really well with global damage sources to eke out extra damage. Does this mean that our big chunky weapons with their percentage damage increases, are they out of luck, right? Are they for lack of a better word, are they screwed when it comes to damage? And the answer is no. And in order to understand this, we need to look at a third type of damage, right? One which is maybe not as inherently obvious. Now I'm going to call these non-weapon dependent damage sources. Now that's a little bit of a misleading name, so let's look at some examples. So, one obvious example is, of course, your cast, right? So if you take something like Zeus's cast, Storm Ring, your cast, of course, is completely independent of your weapon, right? It's the exact same no matter what. But I'm also considering things like Hephaestus' attack in this category. I'm considering things like Zeus's attack in this category. Why is this? Well, okay, sure, with each of these attacks, right, you need to actually hit the enemy with your weapon to proc them, but the main condition on these is not the actual weapon strike, right? The main condition is the timer, right? In Hephaestus's case, this timer is pretty obvious. Hephaestus just shows it to you, right? That in particular, a common boon with zero rarity has a 12-second timer, right? But Zeus also has a timer. He has a timer in terms of the amount of time it takes you to deal the damage to make Blitz actually proc, right? And then he also has the timer associated with the animation of Blitz coming down, right? And so in particular, right, while these two look like they're weapon dependent, they're actually not, right? It doesn't matter if your weapon is attacks fast or slow. These will be doing damage on roughly the same intervals. And so why is this important? Well, in addition to these being kind of weapon independent, right? These are also additional damage sources, right? Zeus's Blitz is its own lightning bolt, right? It will also scale with global damage bonuses. It has the same benefits that the flat damage bonuses from before have, right? But since these are weapon independent, they can be used by anything, and so they are very good ways to up your damage kind of irregardless of what weapon you're using. And in particular, if you're playing a slow and chunky weapon, you should really start to incorporate these into your boon pool so that you can eke out more and more damage, so that your damage scaling doesn't fall off a cliff. Now, one thing to remember with these is that what they care about is how frequently they can be applied, right? How frequently they can be procced. And so this is particularly important because it determines how good they are, right? A low rarity, low palm Hephaestus boon is not very good because it takes 12 seconds, right? A high rarity, high pumped Festus boon, which is down to 2 seconds, well, now you're talking, right? The same thing with Blitz, and this is why Blitz is so good, right? Because Blitz is so easy to apply and proc consistently, right? Blitz is a much more is a very consistent way of finding non-weapon dependent damage, right? Your casts similarly are a consistent way that you can do that. Now, one thing that we've sort of mentioned, but we haven't talked too much about, in fact, we've assumed that it doesn't exist, is power, right? So what is power? Well, power acts as additional base damage. And in this way, right, it's valuable because it gets multiplied by your percentage damage bonuses. Now, this means that it works very well with a lot of different weapons, right? In particular, it works well with low damage weapons that are using flat damage and global damage bonuses. So if we take the example from before with our 20 damage dagger strike and a 20 damage Poseidon wave and the 80% global damage from the Furies, then we arrive at 72. If we add 20 power, then it acts almost like an additional damage source, right? And so since we had 2 damage sources, and then we're adding a third damage source, in this case of 20, of equivalent size, we end up having a 50% damage increase. And that's quite significant, right? But the difference here is that it also works well with medium damage weapons, right? So let's say we're imagining a weapon that has 40 base damage, right? And we're taking, let's say, Apollo's attack for 100% damage bonus on it. And we also have the Furies. If we multiply all this out, we have 112. If we add our baseline power into this, that baseline power gets added into our base damage, which means it gets multiplied by all the percentage damage bonuses that we get. And so here, if we add 20, right, because 20 is half of 40, it's essentially a 50% increase to our base damage, and this gets translated to a 50% increase in our final damage output. So power is pretty universally useful. The only place it starts to really kind of fall off is maybe when you start dealing with very high base damage weapons, right? So particularly the axe, right? The axe needs a lot more power than, for example, the skulls in order to get the same effect, right? Even there, it can still be good. It just depends on how much power you're adding, right? And finally, we arrive at the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail is multiplicative damage sources. So what does that mean? These are things that apply after all your other effects have happened that multiply into all of your other effects. And in order to kind of demonstrate that, we're gonna consider an example. We're gonna consider the case of pressure points, which is a multiplicative damage boost, with Sweet Surrender. Now, these two look pretty much the same in a lot of ways, right? They both apply to all of your damage sources. They both are relatively small percentages, right? But your first thought might be that pressure points is going to be a lot weaker than Sweet Surrender because pressure points is a 3% chance and Sweet Surrender is adding 10% damage, right? And we're going to discover that this isn't the case. Now, why isn't this the case? Well, the first thing to recognize is that your crit percentage is actually twice as effective as you think it is. The reason is because when you crit an enemy, you're doing triple damage, not double damage, right? And so this means that that extra oomph is twice as valuable as you think. So in reality, this kind of 3% crit chance is really more of a 6% damage boost. But you might still think, well, okay, 6% is less than 10%. Surely pressure points is going to be outperformed by Sweet Surrender. And that's not going to happen. So let's calculate this first with Sweet Surrender, right? If we consider Sweet Surrender, so let's first just take the example from before. We have the 20 damage blade attack. We have the 20 damage Poseidon wave. We have an 80% global damage boost. We have 72 damage. When we add in Sweet Surrender, we add the 10%. So the 10% applies to both our 20 base strike and the 10 and our Poseidon wave, and we go from 72 damage to 76 damage. Pressure points is different, right? If we add pressure points instead, pressure points multiplies into the base result. So we end up getting a 6% increase on 72, which is 76.32 points of damage. Why does this happen? Well, this is happening because pressure points is also multiplying into our global damage. It's making our global damage bonus more effective, whereas Sweet Surrender is not multiplying into our pre-existing global damage bonuses. Now, this difference looks pretty small, right? 76 versus 76.32, and this is for a couple of reasons. The first is that we're focusing here on common boons, right? So, of course, if you already have a full setup, then common boons aren't going to move the needle that much, and so the relative difference between them isn't that big. The other thing is we're only doing a partial analysis, right? We're focusing on one particular attack with one particular effect with, a fairly limited number of boons, right? The more boons that you have, the more this is going to start adding up. And towards the end of the game, this is going to be a pretty, at least a somewhat significant difference, especially at higher rarities where the boons are more and more important, right? The other thing is that we compared our multiplicative damage boost to a global damage boost acting on a flat damage increase. And when we talk about global damage boost and flat damage increase, we mentioned that they synergize especially well together, that they multiply essentially into each other, right? And so for flat damage, global damage boosts are an effective kind of substitute, right, for multiplicative damage sources. If we had been using a weapon that had a percentage damage increase instead, the difference would have been quite a bit more pronounced, right? And so this kind of leads us into our final insight, which is that multiplicative damage bonuses are universally useful. In fact, they are, in a mathematical sense, equally useful across all builds, right? And so this is what makes them the holy grail, right? Is that they're always good. But the important thing to remember here is that also that you can substitute for them if you're using a flat damage weapon with global damage bonuses. Percentage damage weapons don't get to substitute in the same manner, and so global multiplicative damage bonuses are more important. Now, it can be kind of hard to figure out what is a multiplicative damage source versus what is a percentage damage source. And so the easy thing to remember is that nearly everything is additive. Nearly everything is not a multiplicative damage source. So I'm going to provide a non-exhaustive list of multiplicative damage sources here. So first we'll focus on the local ones, so the non-global ones. So some examples of these are extra dose, which gives you an extra chance at your attacks. So this is, on average, essentially a multiplier to your attacks and any effects that are dependent on them. Specific crit boons from Artemis, right? So Lethal Snare gives your attacks a percentage chance to crit. Killing Stroke gives your specials a chance to crit. Notably, this only attacks to the damage from your weapons, right? So this only works for the base damage multiplied by any percentage damage bonuses. It won't apply to any effects which are dependent on your weapons. So, for example, it won't, even if you're using an attack and your attack has Poseidon waves, if you have Lethal Snare, those waves aren't going to have a chance to crit, right? Extra Dose does, right? When you have a chance to attack again, you also have a chance, when that second attack happens, you're also going to get a second wave, right? Exceptional Talent is another example. Exceptional Talent is Apollo's legendary, so it allows you to double up on your Omegas. So obviously, if your Omegas are happening twice, then that means that they are essentially getting the same damage 2 times over, so it's a multiplication. Zeus's Double Strike is a good example. As a way, this only works for your Lightning Bolt effects, but it is a multiplier on your Lightning Bolt effects. And then finally, Poseidon and Ares' duo, Arterial Spray, right, gives your waves a percentage chance to happen again. Right, so here you can kind of get the idea of like, okay, what constitutes a multiplicative damage source? It's something that either makes my effects happen again, or something that like something particular that specifically multiplies into them, right? Now, when we're talking about global damage bonuses, then for some examples are specifically again from Artemis, right? She has global crit boons, right? So one example is pressure points, but another very powerful example is vital signs, right? These will apply to anything, right? So, for example, they will apply to your base attack, they'll apply to any additional things, for example, Poseidon Waves, they're going to apply to your cast damage, they're going to apply to everything, right? And that is quite a bit, right? That's quite a bit of extra damage that gets added up, which is why those numbers are so much smaller. Hitch, which is Hera's Curse, also is a multiplicative damage bonus, right? The way Hitch works is that whenever you do damage to an enemy, right, any other enemy which has Hitch, right, takes 15% of that damage, right? So if you imagine that you hit one enemy and you have another enemy with Hitch, then that second enemy is going to take 15%, and it's almost like you're doing 15% more damage, 15% more of your total damage, right? Ares has 2 particularly powerful examples in Grievous Blow and Mutual Destruction. Grievous Blow is gives you a chance, well, both of these boons gives you a chance for any damage you do to be multiplied by 2, right? And since it doesn't specify any particular attack or anything like that, it works for everything again, right? And we can sort of see the same concept here of, multiplying at the end, right? That it gets doubled after it happens. And then the last example is something that maybe isn't going to initially strike you as a multiplicative damage boost, but it is, and that is Demeter's Legendary. So Winter Harvest, if I remember correctly, makes it so that enemies who are at 10% health and frozen die instantaneously. This is the same as essentially chopping off 10% of a boss's health bar, right, or anybody's health bar. And in that sense, right, each point of the each health point of the boss becomes more valuable. It becomes about 11% more valuable, which you can sort of think of as being an 11% damage bonus, right? 11% global multiplicative damage bonus. And the last thing I want to leave you with is to remember that crit, whether it's global or local, is twice as powerful as it looks. A 3% crit bonus from Artemis is actually a 6% multiplicative damage bonus, right? And so that's something that's really important to keep in mind when you're deciding which boons to take. Alright, now I did promise I'm going to include a summary, so here it is, right? So we can think of there being as 5 broad categories of damage. The first one is a percentage damage bonus, so these are things like Apollo's attack, Afro's attack, Hera's attack, right? These work better on weapons which have a large base damage, right? Now, they stack additively with each other, which means they don't synergize with each other, so they have diminishing returns. So you should just grab a couple big ones, or maybe even just one big one, and then not worry about the rest of the stuff, right? Grab your attack, grab origination, maybe grab something like Weed Killer if it's available, and then get out. Don't worry about percentage damage beyond that point. In terms of supplementing their damage, you should either use non-weapon dependent damage, which is universally useful. If you haven't watched the video and you don't know what that is, I'll get to that in the next slide. Or you just start supplementing with defensive boons. You don't need to push your damage that high. You can just start stacking defenses and hoping that things work out, right? Now, the nature of these types of boons is that they only usually want 1 palm. Now, exceptions apply. Different boons are different. They have different palm scaling, but in general, get 1 palm, get out, right? Flat damage bonuses are different. They work better on weapons which have low base damage. These are typically weapons which attack more frequently. And because of the way that they interact with global damage bonuses, they scale a lot better, right? Which means that they're usually roughly twice as effective as you think they are, right? And because they're twice as effective as you think they are, the palm differences are twice as valuable as you think they are, so they can usually do it maybe more than 1 extra palm. So maybe 2 palms, maybe 3 palms. You really don't need more than a few, though. Again, exceptions apply. Non-weapon damage is what we were talking about previously, so this is anything whose primary condition is not hitting the enemy with your weapon. So I'm counting any cast damage here, but I'm also counting something like Blitz, which has its own inherent timer, right? Now, the nice thing about this is that it's relatively weapon independent. You can use it on any weapon. If you feel like your damage is really struggling, you can just grab one of these and it will work with any weapon for the most part, right? As long as the weapon is able to apply these effects fairly frequently. Blitz, in particular, is very weapon independent, right? Blitz it's very situation independent, right? Blitz almost always gets applied at exactly the same rate, regardless of the situation. This is a huge part of why Blitz is so good. Now, because these are independent damage sources, it's the same thing with flat damage, right? They work really well with global damage bonuses like Origination of the Furies and Sweet Surrender from Aphrodite and so on. And in general, they also scale slightly better with palms, so maybe, you go for 2 or 3 palms with them instead of just 1, right? But the important thing to remember, the key thing to remember, is that these are good ways to scale your damage if you're playing a weapon that doesn't use flat damage, and you start feeling like your damage is beginning to fall off, right? Now, power, right? Power is extra base damage on your weapon, right? And this works pretty well for low damage weapons because extra base damage on them is relatively more effective. It works good on medium damage weapons because it gets multiplied by their percentage damage bonuses. And it does fall off a little bit for high damage weapons, although it is universally useful to an extent. And so the thing to remember here is that specifically these multiply into your global damage bonuses. They also multiply into any specific damage bonuses that you have, right? That's something that's special to them. That's something that's unique to them. And then finally, the Holy Grail, right? True multiplicative damage. It's universally useful. Take it whenever you can get it. It's always more valuable than it looks, and it's equivalently useful essentially on all weapons, although it is slightly more important on weapons that use percentage damage bonuses just because those weapons can't rely on global damage scaling. And if you ever have if you aren't sure if something is a multiplicative damage bonus or not, you can check the list, or you could leave a comment and I'll try to get back to you. All right, and that's, I think, where we're going to wrap things up. This was pretty dry, but hopefully we're going to move on to some more fun things. In particular, I'm hoping to make at least a couple of weapon guides. In fact, if anybody's watching this and they want a weapon guide for a particular weapon, please leave a comment. I feel a little awkward saying that, seeing as I have like 5 subscribers and I get like 3 comments a video, but you know, have at it, right? And I think I'm willing to do most weapons. I think the only weapon I'm not really willing to do is Pan, just because I don't really play Pan. I haven't played Pan since its nerfs and recent buffs, and I think it got buffed even, so you can tell I don't really play Pan. I don't really know what I'm doing, but ask for anything else and I'll be happy to provide. Otherwise, I'm going to cover some beginner-friendly weapons and maybe some good weapons kind of for mid-game that scale well into the late game, and I'll leave it there. Anyways, thank you. If you liked the video, then please consider leaving a like, a comment. It really helps me out. Consider subscribing, and goodbye.